What's up guys, Alex here, and in today's video we're looking at the classical variation of the French defense. This starts after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and here after knight c3, rather than the winnower variation, which was the topic of the previous video, or the Rubinstein variation, which will be the topic of the next video, we're going to take a look at this move knight to f6. So basically white has two major options against this move which threatens the pawn. The first is he can go for positional pluses with the move pawn to e5, grabbing some space in the center, and also asking black the question of what exactly he's going to do with this knight on f6. The second variation, by the way, the variation with e5 is known as the Steinitz variation. And the second variation, which is just about equally popular, is the move bishop to g5. In this case, white is more interested in fast development and possibly a quick queenside castle in certain variations. And the idea is just easy development and some piece pressure and some pressure here in the center. This is known as the Byrne variation, named after a chess player called Amos Byrne. So we're going to treat bishop g5 as our main line. So first of all, we'll cover this move pawn to e5. Black here pretty much always goes knight to d7. The only other square that kind of makes some sense is knight to e4, but after knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, and bishop to c4, we see that white's central situation is much better than black's, and this pawn here on e4 could also fall into a lot of trouble. So after e5, therefore black goes knight to d7, and here there are two lines that we're going to take a quick look at. The first one here is f4, that's the main line, but before this I just want to show you this possibility knight c to e2. Well, the idea behind this move is that white wants to anticipate black's next move, pawn to c5, and meet it with pawn to c3, so he's cleared the knight in order to do this. This is just a way of holding on to the major asset that white has in this position. Black should put pressure with knight to c6, and now white for the most part goes pawn to f4 here. I actually prefer Magnus Carlsen's approach here. When he played this before, he went knight to f3, and he sought to just develop with g3, bishop g2, and short castle, and you keep a nice center. For those of you who are interested in a relatively simple approach against the classical variation of the French, if you're playing the white side, I would say that this is a really nice idea. The Anand Shroff variation, named after Anand, who employed this successfully against Shroff on a couple of occasions, continues with the move pawn to f4. But I will say this is very, very risky business. For example, there was one game of theirs that followed with the move queen b6. Black should put pressure here on the pawn on d4, because otherwise, if black does nothing, white is just going to sort of steamroll him. White went knight to f3, and now black here can do a couple of different things, but f6 is a move I really like, and you can see that systematic pressure against white's center. Now the problem is it's not so easy for white to develop. For example, if you play the move pawn to g3 here, and black were to capture, and give this check here on b4, for example, this position can be very, very fragile. For example, it might be natural to block with the bishop here on d2, but after pawn takes e5, if white tries to keep his center, what can actually happen is black will castle, and suddenly all those pawn moves that white has played, you can see that there's serious problems here. For example, white now has to deal with the threat against the knight, so you can go bishop to g2, and now just a crushing blow. This has been played about a half dozen times at the high level. Knight takes e5, so quite a nice little trap. The point is that after white wins this piece, black now goes knight takes e5, and he is threatening checkmate with the move knight d3. That would force king f1, and then queen f2 would be checkmate. And he is also threatening to win this knight here on f3. If white, on the other hand, wins the second piece, then black will have checkmate here on f2 because the queen is supported by the rook. So you can see the dangers. This is just an illustrative line, but you can really hopefully appreciate the dangers involved with extending the center like this. And if you face this as black, what I would recommend is that you keep in mind this possibility of a sacrifice on e5. In fact, just to wrap up this line, Anand, he played a3 in this position in order to guard against these bishop b4 check ideas that I just showed. But after bishop to e7, h4, castle, and rook h3, in spite of Anand's very careful play, covering b4, and then even using the rook to fortify this knight on f3, in spite of all of this, after the moves a5, b3, queen c7, knight to g1, a4, and b4, black still found a way to sacrifice on e5. He captured with the pawns, and then he took here. And in the end, black had won 2 pawns for a piece. And it's not as convincing, of course, as the other variation that we just saw where black takes on e5 and is basically just winning. But here you can see that although black may be down a piece, he's after busting open the center, and white's pieces are very, very uncoordinated, and white's pawns are extremely shaky. So it's not so much material down to B, and in exchange you're getting a lot of things, a lot of other advantages. So therefore, in my opinion, this approach with knight to e2 is quite interesting, but I personally prefer it rather than with f4 to play in a more restrained fashion like Paulsen did with knight to f3. So that's something to investigate for sure. Instead of this, the main line continues with the move pawn to f4, and after c5 here, white now fortifies the center with knight f3. The biggest thing to know about this particular structure is that what usually happens, there's lots of different move orders, lots of different transpositions, but what generally happens is that white plays the bishop to e3, black here begins some expansion on the queen side, and white has this plan of placing his queen on d2. So knight on f3, bishop on e3, queen on d2, and well, black, as he expands, he anticipates the possibility of queenside castle, and you really don't want to do this immediately as white, because among other things, black has the possibility of playing c4 and then just steamrolling steamrolling white rather, with an attack that is much, much faster than white's attack over on the king side. So therefore, before castling, white usually captures here on c5, and if black plays bishop takes c5, now the move I like the most from the white perspective, that I think is the most annoying for black to meet, is the move bishop to d3. One thing that's really important to note is that black can't actually win a piece like this in good circumstances with d4, because if you do this, white can actually take this pawn, and the point is that after bishop takes d4, there would come bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, and bishop to e4, and white would be recovering his piece under very good circumstances. Even worse is the move that all black players have faced that reach this position, knight takes d4, and the point here is this very clever move, knight to e4. The point is white is threatening the move pawn to c3, and if you move the knight immediately, then this guy over here is falling. It turns out, amazingly, that there's no good way of for black to keep the piece. It's just not possible, because, for example, the move bishop to b6 here would lead to knight d6 check, and after the king moves, there would come bishop to e4. So the double attack here would mean that black is going to have to give back the piece. In fact, this is really a trap worth knowing from the white side and from the black side, because players as great as former world champion Vasilin Topalov have fallen for this trick. If, on the other hand, black knows this trick, then he should play the move queen to b6. Now, after queen to b6, the threat is to capture here, so white usually drops the bishop back. And now, let's say black develops with bishop to b7, white now goes ahead and castles. And this position, it can take many different turns. For example, rook c8 or castle or h6. Many things have been played. But sooner or later, these bishops will come off the board. Very often, the game continues exactly as I'm showing you. And the very important thing to be aware of if you're playing from the white side here is that you want to play for this particular structure. You see, the pawns for black are all on light squares, and his light squared bishop as a result is a little bit passive. And this is not the case for white, who has his pawns on dark squares and he has a light squared bishop. So this position is usually very comfortable for white, and usually we say that white is playing for two results: either he'll win or he'll get a draw. And a way in which at the club level a lot of players go wrong from this position is they'll play something like king e7, white will go knight e2 in order to plant a knight on this beautiful square d4, and black will see an opportunity to win the bishop and will think that that's a great trade, a knight for a bishop. So he'll often go, for example, the move knight c5, knight d4, he'll exchange here, and then he'll take this bishop. And I myself have won a few games basically in this exact way online, and I even had a couple of students who I taught this line to and these concepts, and a few weeks or a few months later they came to me and they said, you know what, we got this possibility in an over the board game, and we won pretty much exactly by following this strategy. So this is very, very powerful positional idea here of good piece against bad piece. So I think the main takeaway of this entire variation is that white plays very principled, grabs a bunch of space, and then just defends his space. And what black does is he tries to fight in the center, and he usually does succeed to get rid of a bunch of pieces and pawns. But his biggest risk is that he might end up with a structure that looks like this, the pawns here, that looks like this, all pawns on the light squares and a bishop on b7. And he has to be really careful that this bishop will not end up being a very bad piece, and he won't have to suffer too much in a late middle game or end game. So I think this is a really great try for white to play like this. I think it's a very good way of pressing black, and white does have quite a lot more wins from this position than the black side. However, if you don't want to play the move e5, then you can play this move bishop to g5, and this is the so-called burn variation. And black now has a variety of options. He has the move bishop to b4 or the move bishop to e7. In fact, after the move bishop to e7, we won't look at it too much. It used to be the main line. But what I would recommend from the white side, I think the biggest problem of this line is push the pawn on e5, and then after the knight moves, exchange here. And what you'll find is that after f4, white will actually set himself up very similarly to what we just saw. And so in the end, it's very, very similar to this line where the problem is this light squared bishop. So it's quite similar to the Steinitz variation that we just looked at. So that would be the big thing to remember about bishop to e7. Bishop b4 is known as the McCutcheon variation, and I think objectively it's quite an interesting try. The point is that after e5, black counters with h6 and white is not able to win a piece. In the main line, white used to put the bishop on d2, and after bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, knight e4, black actually ended up in positions that I thought were quite good, because white would go queen g4 and provoke black into making some kind of weakness here on the dark squares. But in the end, it turns out that those weaknesses are not so relevant, because after the move bishop d3, black can use this knight to remove that strong dark squared bishop. And so suddenly having these weak dark squares, it's not such a big deal when your opponent doesn't have that powerful dark squared bishop to go with it. And this feeling like here black is actually fine, he'll just continue with his usual stuff, pressing the center. It's this very feeling that had me look a little bit more deeply into this position and ask myself, if I were white, if I was playing this, what would I do? Where would I would I be happy with that position, or would I try to find something else? And what I noticed is that a few players are playing this move bishop to c1, including great players like Veselin Topalov. The results have been reasonably encouraging, especially after black's main move, knight to e4, sort of taking the bait. It looks like it makes a lot of sense to put pressure here on this knight now that there's a pin. But the point is, after queen g4, now if you get a position like this, it turns out that white can, first of all, he can defend with the knight and keep this strong bishop, or he could even go a3 and sacrifice a pawn here, but just play on as normally. And the point is, you've sacrificed that doubled pawn, which was certainly worth plenty, but not worth as much as maybe a healthy pawn. And you, in exchange, you've managed to keep this bishop, and also you've gained some time because the knight here is not very useful piece, so it'll probably have to move back sooner or later. So now in this situation, with that semi-open b file and the king side a little bit weak, it's hard to say exactly how black will continue. I think this is really interesting, and maybe something along these lines is the way of trying to punish the McCutcheon variation. So this all came from this idea of meeting bishop g5 with bishop to b4. So we've looked at bishop to e7, the old main line, and bishop to b4, which leaves us with only one move, and that's pawn takes e4 here. Now white recaptures with knight takes e4, and black usually blocks with the bishop while continuing his development. White captures with the bishop. That's an important little detail to keep in mind. If you capture with the knight, then after bishop takes, queen takes, black gets a pretty easy game. He's exchanged a bunch of pieces, he'll castle soon, and sooner or later he'll play c5 and break down that center that white has. So therefore what white does in order to try and put some pressure on the black position is to take like this, and now if black captures back with the bishop, he doesn't take, which would just lead to the position we looked at, but instead he continues his normal development with knight to f3. Now black typically goes ahead and castles, and white plays queen to d2. And the idea in this position after knight to d7 is that white will go ahead and castle here. Then we have a situation of opposite side castling. So for white, his idea is to use sometimes the g5 square, usually play h4, put the bishop on d3, and plant a knight on g5 and launch some kind of attack. And on top of that, he wants to sort of make black's life a little bit difficult because of this powerful center. On the other hand, from black's perspective, he argues, look, my structure is really solid here. I also have the bishop pair, which in some situations you might regret giving me that by chopping here on f6. And even though I'm a little bit behind in development, it's not the end of the world. I can, for example, continue with a move like pawn to b6, which is one of the main options here for black. And after white continues, let's say, with bishop to d3, black will put a bishop on b7 and say, well, now I've developed all of my minor pieces, and if you give me even a little bit more time, I will soon be able to play c5. And when I play c5, your central advantage will be gone. And on top of that, I will potentially open up lines against your king. White continues with this type of attacking play. And already black could go c5. But usually what he does is he plays bishop e7. If you go c5 immediately, you do have this weak d6 square. And also in some situations, white can capture, and maybe you don't have as much control over c5 as you'd like. So most players here as black, they put the bishop on e7. And as white tries to maneuver and improve his coordination, black breaks with the move c5. And we've seen a lot of grandmaster games where the play has continued as follows: knight to g5 here. And after h6, white launches a check here, king h8, and drops the bishop back. And after bishop takes e4, he plays knight takes e4, and black just plays queen to c7. And after king to b1, black can even capture immediately, let's say. And after a move like knight takes d4, suddenly you see that a lot of material has come off the board. black has repelled any serious white attack, and he might even continue with a move like knight c5, offering more piece exchanges, and ultimately the position is more or less equal here. So this is one way in which the line might evolve. It can evolve in a million different ways, of course, but the main idea to keep in mind from the white side is that you want to use your center and possibilities here of attack on the king side to try and create problems for black, and you also want to exploit black's lack of development for now. On the other hand, if you are the black player, what you want to keep in mind is that if you can just be precise enough to complete your development, for example b6 and bishop to b7 ideas, then as long as you don't blunder, you don't make a mistake, which is easy to do in this type of position, but as long as you avoid making a big mistake, then over the next 5 or 6 moves you will execute a plan usually involving the move c5, and you'll actually be perfectly equal and go towards a draw. Now you might ask yourself, well, I don't really want to play the French defense and play for a draw, and in this case then this line with bishop takes f6 and bishop takes f6 may not be for you, and in fact you should rely on the knowledge and the pioneering work of Alexander Morozevich, after which this pawn recapture g takes f6 is named after. At first sight it seems like a silly thing to do, to double your pawns, but the point is seen after white's normal developing play with knight f3, and that is the move pawn to f5 is suddenly possible. Suddenly that very strong knight on e4 is no longer able to remain on e4. It's considered that the c3 square is best, and now black plays another kind of cryptic looking move, which is the move pawn to a6. Point is that if white, let's say, continues with some calm move like queen d2 in order to castle queenside like in previous variations, then black can follow with pawn to b5, and queenside castle here can be met by a move like bishop to b7, and you can see the bishop is really on a great square. Some nice space here on the queen side gives black attacking chances, and the double pawns were not so silly even after having completed its job of the knight being kicked back, because there is some nice central control and a semi-open g-file. Black also has the f6 square now in order to put the bishop there in the future. So the heart of this line from the black perspective is that he actually is going to get really nice piece play, and the play is extremely complex, and it's really fighting chess from the start, and may the best player win. Of course, let's not paint a picture that is unrealistic about this line from the black perspective. It's not, heaven for black and hell for white. The problem with making a structure like this and making so many pawn moves is that for now the black king remains in the center of the board, and in this particular position the white player usually has continued d5 with some nice sacrificial ideas. And of course something like capture and knight takes d5 would really be ugly, because you open up that e-file, and on top of that you damage your pawn structure. And it's also certainly no plan to just continue your development and allow this, because the king is too weak, the pawn on e6 is too weak, and even the open d-file can be used against black. So what do you do if you're black here? Most players have gone pawn to b4, and the intention is that if this knight moves, then of course black will be able to win a central pawn, and all of a sudden he's actually much better. But here the white players have an aggressive idea, bishop to c4, and if you capture here on c3, now queen takes c3, hitting the rook on h8, and it's very easy to go wrong here as black. For example, the natural move bishop f6 would just lose on the spot to queen b4, hitting this bishop, and the point is that if you try and defend this bishop, then comes a move like pawn takes e6, and after pawn takes e6, bishop takes e6 just completely crushes black. You can see the black king is in the center of the board. After queen takes e6, you would just play queen takes b7 here, hitting the rook, and next thing you know, you're also facing rook to e1. So as black, you can pretty much resign here. So that's just a sample of the kind of dangers that that face black in these lines. Of course, after queen takes, with best play, the move is e5 here. With best play, white has compensation for the sacrificed piece, but whether he's completely winning or not is far less clear. I still wouldn't want to play this as black, because again, kind of similar to a variation we saw previously, where where we were covering the Anand Shroff variation, and we saw this idea of black sacrificing a piece against white setup. That was with this line of knight c2 e2, for those of you who recall. Here similarly, you know, white may only have, what does he have? He has only one pawn for the piece for now, but he's going to get a second pawn, and black's pieces are all sort of scrunched up, and I really don't like this position at all for black. White could continue with a move like queen b3, hitting this bishop, and again, so easy to go wrong. Let's say you play queen c8 now after knight takes e5. The position is just horrible. d6 ideas are coming, knight takes f7 ideas in many situations are coming, and you know, the king is not going to find shelter. So these are, again, sample lines, but the point is that both sides have to be very, very careful. If you're not careful as white, the pieces will just come rolling in for black. The bishop here on f6, bishop on b7, an attack on the b file, an attack on the g file, and it's really really horrible. So this is the variation for those of you who want sharp dynamic play at more or less all costs. And I think objectively the good news for the black players, I think objectively the line is very, very sound, and I think that's why it's become the most popular response against bishop to g5. So this is a line really worth knowing, because here in this position, if we take a step back after knight c3, if you are either playing the French or playing against it, the move knight f6, here knight c3 is the most popular third move, and knight f6 is the second most popular, more or less equally popular, just narrowly losing out in popularity to the winnower, which was the topic, the previous topic. So you will see this a lot if you're a 1e4 player, and in this video I think we've covered both of the main systems here for white, which is e5 and bishop to g5. And in this last case with bishop to g5, I really believe that the best bet for black is to take this pawn on e4, and after knight takes e4 to play the move bishop to e7, and after bishop takes f6 already have this option to capture here with the pawn and go for this funky creative play, which I think is just super interesting, especially for those tactical and dynamic players. If on the other hand you're looking at this video and you're saying, man, I really like the French, but I don't want to ruin my structure like this, or you're playing in a tournament, let's say, and you're playing against somebody who is a bit stronger than you, and you wouldn't mind the draw, let's say, or somebody who you know is very tactically sharp player, then maybe bishop takes f6, a variation favored by the strong grandmaster Yevgeny Baryaev, is a perfectly good move. You just have to be a little bit careful as black that you are able to complete your development properly, and then break with c5 and chip away at the sort of the root of the white advantage, which is this nice central situation. If on the other hand you face this as white, you should try and profit from mistakes that black makes in trying to sort of get out of his cage here with all of his pieces, because for white he has much smoother development and can castle queenside, and on top of this launch a I can never draw arrows for the life of me, launch a kingside attack. So guys, that brings this particular chapter to a close. We're now 2/3 of the way through the systems, beginning with the move knight to c3, move 3 here, after pawn to d5, knight to c3. We've looked at bishop to b4, the aggressive winnower, now knight f6, the classical, and coming up next is pawn takes e4, the Rubinstein. So I hope to see you there.